I never thought the sound of a heart monitor could feel comforting, but in that quiet rehab room in Westwood, it was the only rhythm that made sense. The walls were pale, sterile. No music, no mirrors. Just the steady beep and the weak rise and fall of Roman Adler's chest under thin hospital blankets. My name is Mila. I'm 34, born in Brooklyn, raised in back corners of rehearsal studios, and trained by the most brilliant, most complicated man I've ever known. Roman wasn't just a choreographer. He was the standard, the storm. And now, the storm was fading. Lara sat by his left side, holding his hand like it was still strong enough to grip hers back. Her posture was flawless, even now, still holding herself like the prima she once was. On the other side stood Yasmin, quiet, older than I remembered, but still carrying herself like a ghost of center stage. Then the door creaked, and Theo stepped in. His eyes landed on the bed, and for a second, I saw him shrink. Not physically, but like someone had pulled the air right out of him. He was Roman's biological son, but it had always been complicated. Behind him, Yasmin moved forward, her hand brushing his back. I didn't think he'd be this bad, Theo murmured, eyes on the 4-line taped to Roman's hand. Lara didn't look at him. He had a seizure 3 nights ago. They didn't think he'd wake up again. But he did. I added, my voice sounding smaller than I expected. This morning, briefly, Theo walked to the foot of the bed, looking down at a man who once filled stadiums with just a flick of his wrist. And now, he's been in and out, Lara said. But mostly out. We all went quiet. The kind of silence that buzzed in your ears. Then, Roman stirred. Just slightly. A flutter under his eyelids. Lara stood up. Yasmin leaned in. His eyes opened. Gray, watery, but alert for a second. They locked on Yasmin. A raspy breath. Yas. Her lips trembled. I'm here, Roman. He blinked again. Slowly. You came. She reached for his hand. I did. I needed to. I needed to say something. Roman's hand twitched. Maybe it was instinct. Or memory. Either way, he didn't let go. I'm sorry, Yasmin whispered. For what I did. For what I broke. I thought I was doing the right thing. But I wasn't. I was scared. And selfish. Roman closed his eyes. A single tear slid from the corner of his left one. I know. She let out a soft gasp, as if that alone had cracked her open. Can you forgive me? A long pause. Then Roman's voice, dry but clear. Lara helped me to forgive. I looked at Lara, who still hadn't sat down. Her eyes glistened, but her face stayed still. Yasmin leaned closer, forehead almost to Roman's. Thank you, she breathed. No one else spoke. The heart monitor kept its beat, steady and slow. And for the first time in a decade, the 4 of us were in the same room, not as dancers, not as enemies, but as people who had loved and hurt the same man. Theo didn't wait long after Roman drifted back into sleep. The second the old man's breathing evened out, Theo's voice cut through the silence like a knife. So that's it, he said, not looking at Yasmin. You show up 10 years later, drop an apology, and we're just supposed to move on. Yasmin straightened in her chair. I'm not asking you to move on. Then what are you asking for? To speak. His jaw tightened. You had a decade to speak. Lara looked at me, but didn't say anything. I stayed frozen in my chair, watching them. Like always, I was the observer. The one who'd lived in the ruins after everyone else walked away. Yasmin let out a slow breath. I never planned to come back. Not after what I did. No kidding, Theo said bitterly. She nodded. But I couldn't let him die without knowing the truth. Or hearing me say it out loud. Lara finally spoke, her voice careful. He always knew parts of it. He just never talked about it. I sabotaged the tour, Yasmin said. Just like that. Her voice didn't waver. The Tokyo leg. I changed the lighting cues. Missed flight confirmations. Slipped misinformation to the press. The reviews weren't just bad luck. That was me. Theo looked stunned, but he didn't interrupt. I wanted it to fail, she said quietly. Because I couldn't take it anymore. The pressure. The weight of his name on everything I did. I was drowning, and he didn't even see me. You could have just left, Theo snapped. You didn't have to destroy him. She flinched. I know, but I wasn't thinking like that. I was angry. Lost. And Andre, he was there. Lara's posture shifted at the mention of his name. You mean the rival choreographer you had an affair with? Theo said sharply. Yasmin met his glare head-on. Yes. Mila, I mean me. I sat straighter. I'd heard rumors for years. Whispers. Half-truths. But hearing it like this, it still hit hard. I didn't love Andre, Yasmin continued. Not really. But he made me feel seen. Not used. I hadn't felt that in a long time. Roman gave you everything, Mila blurted. My voice too loud, too fast. He trusted you, built pieces around you, and you just broke it all. I know, she said again, softer now. I didn't come to defend myself. I came to admit it. Theo folded his arms. So what? You're a martyr now? No. I'm someone who knows exactly what she did. Lara leaned forward, her voice lower. You didn't just ruin a tour, Yasmin. You ruined him. That collapse in Singapore? That wasn't just exhaustion. That was betrayal. Yasmin nodded, eyes glassy. I was with Andre the day the footage leaked. You remember the segment, don't you? That dance Roman created for Theo's scholarship gala? Andre released it as his own choreography, credited me as co-creator. She looked straight at Theo. That's why I confessed. Because I didn't want him to believe I stole from Roman's soul. Theo didn't speak. His eyes flicked to his father, still asleep. Then back to Yasmin. I told him everything, she whispered. And I broke him twice. Once with my betrayal. And again when I left. No one answered her. Not right away. Because no one knew what to say. Yasmin didn't ask for permission to keep going. She just did. I didn't fall into Andre's arms because of passion, she said. That would have been easier to explain. It was emptiness. That hollow space between what Roman gave to the world and what he had left for me. I remember Lara shifting in her seat again, folding her arms tightly across her chest like she was holding something in. He was brilliant, Yasmin said. God, you know that. You all know. But brilliance eats everything around it if you don't draw a line. Theo stared at the floor. You were his partner. In name, she said. But toward the end, I was just the assistant who knew how he liked his dancers prepped and his socks folded. He offloaded so much onto me, creatively and emotionally. And then the moment the critics turned on us, he put distance between us. I went from his everything to a liability overnight. So you ran to someone else, Lara said flatly. Yasmin looked at her. I collapsed into someone else. There's a difference. I felt myself tense up. I'd spent years helping Roman reassemble his name, his company, his pride. And hearing her talk about the crash like it was a symptom instead of a consequence made me want to scream. I wasn't proud of it, Yasmin said, as if she could read the room. Andre knew what he was doing. He was charming. He was validating. And he had one goal, to beat Roman. And I was the weapon he used to do it. Theo finally looked up. So when he stole the choreography, it wasn't stolen at first, she interrupted. It was borrowed. Adapted. That's what Andre told me. But then the Tokyo routine, the one Roman created after his mother died, that one was sacred. And Andre used it anyway. Theo's eyes narrowed. You told him not to? I begged him. And then you confessed. She nodded. I knew the second that footage aired with my name attached, Roman would see it. And he'd know. Not just that I had betrayed him personally, but professionally. That I'd let someone else claim his grief. His movement. Lara was quiet now. Still, but alert. Yasmin's voice cracked. I never stopped loving him. Even when I hated him. Even when I thought I wanted someone else. My body knew his music before it knew my own heartbeat. No one moved. Even Roman, asleep just feet away, seemed like a ghost hovering over the conversation. Theo broke the silence. So what did he say? When you told him everything. Yasmin swallowed hard. He didn't speak. He just walked out. Didn't say a word. And the next morning, his attorney served me the severance contract. And Andre? I asked. She didn't blink. He disappeared from the industry within 6 months. Turns out, once he lost me, he had nothing else to steal. I could still feel it. The echo of that scandal. How quickly the world turned on Roman once the tour collapsed. No one cared that he'd built his company from sweat and blood. They only cared about the headlines. And about how his muse had left him in public shame. Theo leaned back, arms crossed. You know he never danced again after that. I know, Yasmin whispered. That's what you took from him. I know. Lara looked up at the ceiling, like she was trying to hold back tears. He choreographed in secret. But he never performed. Never taught a masterclass. Not after you. I didn't ask for forgiveness, Yasmin said. Not from you. Only from him. She looked back at the hospital bed. Roman hadn't moved. But I wondered if he was still listening. Maybe he always had been. After that night, everything cracked. Roman didn't just end things with Yasmin. He shut the whole world out. No interviews. No explanations. Just silence, and then the headlines did the rest. Laura was the one who picked up the pieces. She didn't brag about it, but we all knew. If Roman's name survived the scandal, it was because Laura refused to let it die. I flew to Paris the morning after it all broke, she said, still not looking at Yasmin. Roman was holed up in that studio in Montmartre, sleeping on the floor. He hadn't eaten. He was sketching routines on napkins. Theo blinked. You were there. I booked a red-eye. I didn't even pack a bag. I just showed up. I looked over at Laura. She didn't say it like she wanted credit. She said it like it had haunted her ever since. I told him I'd help, she said. Rebuild. Rebrand. Whatever he needed. I brought Mila in 6 months later. We started over. My throat tightened a little at that. That was when my whole life changed. That was when I stopped being just a dancer and became something more, someone Roman depended on. Yasmin was quiet, listening. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself. Everyone thought the company was finished, I said. But we turned it around. Laura nodded. Barely. It was Mila's choreography that saved our New York winter season. And it was Theo's name that softened a few angry board members. Theo shrugged like it wasn't a big deal, but I saw the flicker in his expression. We'd all fought to keep the legacy alive, even if we never said it out loud. Yasmin finally spoke. I tried to work again. No one would hire me. No one would even return my calls. Dance is a small world, Laura said coldly. Andre burned more bridges than he realized. I know, Yasmin whispered. I ended up in Boise, teaching basic technique to middle schoolers at a community center. That's what the industry thought I was worth. I bit my tongue. Part of me wanted to feel bad, but part of me didn't. Not yet. I turned down every marriage proposal I got, she added softly. And there were a few. Wealthy producers. One of the festival chairs from Lion. But I couldn't say yes. Not when I still dreamed about him every week. Theo leaned forward. So why now? Because he's dying, she said simply. And I didn't want the last chapter of his life to be silence. No one responded. The beeping from Roman's monitor filled the space between us again. Then Laura sat up straighter, like something had shifted in her chest. I overheard him once, she said. Roman. A couple years after you left. I was backstage, and he didn't know I was there. He was talking to a patron from Zurich, I think. Said he wasn't sure how he'd ever really feel whole again. Yasmin blinked rapidly, her breath catching. He said, I think I'll always love her. But I'm too tired to try again. The words hit harder than anything else that had been said all day. Laura stared down at her hands. That night, I went in his room, and I seduced him. Theo's eyebrows lifted. Even I sat back in surprise. I was terrified, she said. Terrified he'd take you back. Terrified we'd lose everything we'd rebuilt. I needed him to look at me again. Just once. Like he used to look at you. For the first time, Yasmin looked truly stunned. Not angry. Not defensive. Just stunned. I didn't plan it, Laura whispered. But I didn't stop it either. And just like that, the truth lay bare between us. 3 women, tangled in love and fear, orbiting the same man like planets caught in gravity they never asked for. For a while, nobody said anything. Laura sat still, like she couldn't believe she'd said it out loud. Her hand rested on her thigh, unmoving. Roman hadn't stirred, but the tension in the room crackled like static. Theo was the first to break the silence. So you seduced him, to keep him away from Yasmin? Laura didn't flinch. I wanted to believe it was more complicated than that. But yeah, that was part of it. Yasmin exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair. And here I thought I was the only villain in the room. You're not, Laura said. I was scared. He was finally starting to look stable again. Starting to laugh again. And then I heard him say your name like it still hurt. I spoke before I thought about it. So you tried to save him? Laura looked at me, her eyes tired. I tried to hold on to the life we built. Maybe that makes me selfish. But I wasn't ready to lose him again. Not after what we'd gone through. Theo let out a slow breath and leaned back in his chair. God, you dancers are dramatic. We all turned to look at him, startled. He smirked. Come on. It's like watching a soap opera, but with better posture. Mila, me, I laughed before I could stop myself. Yasmin cracked a smile, and even Laura shook her head, just a little. Then it got quiet again. Not tense, just thoughtful. I always wondered, Laura said softly, if Roman ever really loved me. Or if I was just what was available. You were more than that, I said. He respected you. Respect isn't love. I think it was both, Yasmin said quietly. He couldn't have created what he did with you if there was nothing real. Laura met her gaze. And this time, it wasn't hostile. Just tired. Then I felt it. This moment inside me, sharp and small, a memory rising up. I have a confession, I said. Something Theo and I did. Lara raised her eyebrows. Oh God. What? Theo grinned. She's right. We're not totally innocent either. What did you do? Yasmin asked. I looked down, a little embarrassed now. After you left, Roman was a wreck. We all saw it. He'd spend hours in the studio alone. Wouldn't eat. Wouldn't sleep. Theo nodded. He was choreographing at night. In secret. Stuff no one ever saw. I found some of the footage, I added. One night, I came in late and saw him dancing barefoot to silence. Just lost in it. Like he didn't know how to stop. Lara's eyes softened. He never showed that to me. He never showed it to anyone, Theo said. So Mila and I, we tried to bring him back. I smiled sheepishly. We started pushing the two of you together. Subtle stuff. Theo would fake emergencies so you'd stay after rehearsals. I'd mess with the schedules so you'd have late-night solos. Lara blinked. You did all that. We didn't know what else to do, I said. He needed someone. And you were already there. Yasmin nodded slowly. So you played matchmaker. For the sake of his spirit. Theo chuckled. Didn't expect it to work so well. Lara looked down, her voice almost a whisper. I loved him. Not like you did. But I did. I believe you, Yasmin said. And for the first time, there was no bitterness in her voice. Outside, the sun was starting to dip lower, casting soft orange light through the blinds. Roman hadn't moved in hours. But inside the room, something had shifted. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. We were all just dancers in a ruined studio, trying to build something again from the dust. It was Yasmin who brought it up. We were sitting quietly, the four of us, letting the air settle. Outside, the sky was soft gray. That time of evening when everything feels like it's holding its breath. There's something none of you know, she said, her voice low. Roman wrote one more piece. Lara looked up. What? A final routine, Yasmin said. Never performed. I found the notebook years ago, back when I was packing my things from the studio. He must have hidden it behind the old speakers. I leaned forward. What kind of piece? It was called Unspoken, she said. Just that. One word. Scribbled at the top in his handwriting. I almost didn't look through it. But I did. Theo's brow furrowed. Why didn't you say anything before now? Because it wasn't mine to share, she said. And I didn't think any of you would want to hear it from me. What was it about? Lara asked, softer now. Yasmin swallowed. It was us. All of us. The way we broke each other. The way we held on anyway. I don't know how to explain it, but the choreography, it wasn't angry. It was grieving. Like he was telling a story he didn't know how to say out loud. I felt the hairs on my arms rise. I'd seen Roman's private work before. Pieces he never intended to release. But this sounded like something deeper. I think it was his goodbye, Yasmin added. Lara closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them. He gave me something once. A flash drive. Told me it was just sketches. I never looked at it. Theo raised an eyebrow. You still have it? She nodded slowly. It's in my apartment. I didn't think it mattered. It matters now, I said. There was a pause. And then, I said what I hadn't dared say until that moment. We should perform it. Yasmin blinked. You're serious? As a tribute, I said. At his celebration of life. One final piece. The one he couldn't bring himself to share. Lara looked at me, then at Yasmin. All three of us. I nodded. It should be us. Who else could do it justice? Theo gave a half smile. The ghosts of Roman Adler, brought to life one last time. Yasmin looked away, her jaw tightening. What if we can't do it? What if it breaks us all over again? Then we let it, Lara said. And we danced through it. None of us moved. But in that moment, I think we all knew. This was how it had to end. 3 women. One final routine. And the man we all loved, flawed, brilliant, broken, watching from wherever dancers go when the lights finally dim. 2 weeks later, Roman died in his sleep. The nurse said it was peaceful. No machines, no alarms. Just a long exhale that never came back. Theo was with him, holding his hand. The rest of us arrived an hour later, and by then, the room was already too quiet. We didn't talk much that day. Grief wasn't loud. It just sat between us like a fifth person. Watching. Listening. The celebration of life was held at the Lyric Theater in downtown LA, a place Roman had once called too flashy for serious work, but secretly adored because of the acoustics. Every seat was filled. Former dancers, rival choreographers, patrons, students, old lovers, even some critics who used to rip his work to shreds and now wore respectful black. People Roman hadn't spoken to in years suddenly remembered how deeply they'd admired him. Funny how death pulls loyalty from the shadows. Theo stood backstage in a simple suit, holding a single program in his hand. When the house lights dimmed, he walked to the podium. "My father lived in rhythm," he began. "Not the kind you measure with counts. The kind that lives in your breath, your bones." He could see the music in people before they heard it in themselves. His voice cracked halfway through the eulogy, but he didn't apologize. He just swallowed hard and kept going. He was demanding, brilliant, and sometimes impossible. But everything I know about beauty, I learned from watching him break himself in pursuit of it. Silence. And then, applause, not the usual kind. This was softer, slower. Like people were clapping for something sacred. And then the stage went dark. A single spotlight. 3 women stepped into it. Me, Laura, Yasmin. We didn't introduce the piece. We didn't need to. The music started, just a piano, slow and aching. Unspoken began. Yasmin danced first. Her solo was full of sharp lines and sudden collapses, a story of power and fracture. It was the kind of movement that made people uncomfortable, like they'd walked in on something too private. She ended kneeling, one hand reaching out to nothing. Laura followed. Her movement was quieter, more precise. Grief held behind the ribs. The control she'd always prided herself on, now used to keep her heart from spilling open. When she lifted her face to the lights, the whole audience leaned forward, like they didn't want to miss a second of it. Then came me. My solo wasn't about love or loss. It was about what came after. The rebuilding. The years spent holding a legacy together with bruised hands and silent loyalty. I danced for the girl who wanted to be seen by the man who taught her everything, and never knew how to say thank you. We didn't rehearse the final sequence too much. Roman wouldn't have wanted it perfect. He would have wanted it honest. We met center stage. 3 bodies, 3 histories, moving in and out of one another's space. We lifted, balanced, fell, caught. At one point, Laura held me while Yasmin wept silently into my shoulder. It wasn't choreographed. It just happened. When the music ended, we stood still, breathless, arms entwined like we'd always been meant to end up that way. The lights went down. No bows. Just silence. And then the applause came, loud, unfiltered, stunned. Backstage, people cried. People hugged. People said things like, "That's the most vulnerable thing I've ever seen, and he would have loved it." Yasmin found her way to the small urn on the tribute table and knelt beside it. "Goodbye, Roman," she whispered. "I kept it in too long. But we said it now. We danced it." She touched the side of the urn and closed her eyes. Laura stood beside her a moment later. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. And when they embraced, there wasn't a single person in the room who thought it was fake. They weren't rivals anymore. Just 2 women who survived the same man. The streets outside the lyric were still damp from an early evening rain. Streetlights glowed in soft halos, and the marquee lights hummed like they were holding their breath. We didn't rush to leave. A small group of us lingered on the sidewalk. Me, Theo, Laura, Yasmin. The crowd had filtered out. The people who came to cry, to gossip, to be seen. But we stayed, quiet, like none of us wanted to be the first to break whatever spell the performance had cast. Theo stuck his hands in his pockets and looked up at the glowing letters. "Celebration of Life, Roman Adler." He would have hated that title, he said. I smiled. He would have demanded retrospective of greatness instead. Yasmin chuckled under her breath. With at least 3 solo curtain calls. We all laughed a little, not because it was funny, but because we needed to. Because it kept the ache in our chests from caving in again. "Thank you," Theo said, looking at all of us. "For doing this. For helping give him that ending." Laura nodded. It was time. For all of us. Yasmin looked down at her hands for a moment, then spoke. "I'm moving to New Orleans," she said. "I've been talking with a community center there. They want to start a youth choreography program. No funding, barely any space. But they're hungry, like we were." I felt something shift in my chest. Not sadness. Not exactly joy either. But something like peace. "I'll come teach," I said. "Whenever you need. Just say the word." Laura turned toward her. "Same. I'm due for a sabbatical anyway." Yasmin blinked, touched. "You'd really do that?" Lara's voice was soft. "We were all his girls. Might as well pass it on. Theo looked out at the street, at the long shadows stretching under the lamplight. Funny, he said. He was always afraid his work would disappear with him. But tonight proved it won't. No, I said. It won't. We stood there a little longer, not talking, just breathing in the night air, the city noise, the feeling that something had ended and something else, something quieter, had begun. When we finally turned to go, we didn't say goodbye. We didn't need to. Some stories don't end. They echo. In motion. In silence. In grace.